Hey, what is up everybody? Welcome back to another Terraria tier list. And you may be thinking that, you've done this one already. Yeah, I have. But that one is outdated compared to my newer ones. It's a little gross, it's a little bad per se. So we're updating it, and then we're gonna go into the ultimate weapons tier list. So I'm gonna go ahead and get straight into it. Let's start off with the swords. First up, we have all of the wooden swords. And I mean, what can I really say about the wooden swords? We all know they're bad, only used at the start of a playthrough for a grand total of like 5 minutes before you find something better. We gotta throw them in the F tier easily. Next up, we have the ore short swords. Similar to the wooden swords, the ore short swords are actually even more worthless somehow. You need harder resources to craft them, and let's just say there's a reason most people just throw away their copper short sword. F tier again. Next up, we have the ore broadswords. Now, I'm going to give the ore broadswords the benefit of the doubt here. They are definitely more usable than the wooden swords and short swords, but you're still only really using these for a small section of the playthrough, and you'll most likely be using these to take on all of your enemies. If there was a D tier, I'd put them in that, but for now, I'll rest them into the F tier, but like in the middle more so. Next up, the cactus sword. F tier. Zombie sword. With a rework prepared for 1.4.5, this weapon might be good, but not yet. F tier. Ant lion mandible. F tier. F bad, bad F. F tier bad. Bone sword. F tier once again. Now let me clarify, I think a lot of these basic swords are actually somewhat usable against like groups of enemies and stuff, but pre-hard mode only has one event you're gonna need to do, and that's the goblins, which are not very hard. Sorry swords. F tier you go. The katana, the candy cane sword, and the exotic scimitar. For the sake of time, since there are 900 swords, I'm shoving these three all together. All these are fine, but like the previous explanation, just not worth getting. If there was a D, once again, I'd put them in that, but for now, F tier. The bladed glove. Let's take a break from the F tier for no other reason that Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite of the classic horror giants. Yep, that's it. Also, this weapon does attack fast enough to keep enemies away. C tier. The Gladius, the Falcon Blade, the Tentacle Spike, Purple Clubberfish, and Bat. Let's go back into the F tier with a big group of weapons. All of the following I don't think are good enough to make it out of the F tier. They are either too slow or don't do enough damage or don't have enough range to make them worth using. Phase Blades. Now, even though the Phase Blades all have decent damage and speed, they are not any better than the previous group of weapons until they get that upcoming rework, which might skyrocket them up the rankings. But that's for the next updates tier list. F tier for the Phase Blades. The Ice Blade, finally the first real weapon. The Ice Blade is a very decent sword. Its damage is worse than some of those true melee weapons from before, but it has a projectile, and I believe it's the first weapon you'll reasonably use against the Eye of Cthulhu. It's not much better than that, however, I'm going to leave it in the C tier. The Enchanted Sword. The Enchanted Sword is the OG GOAT. A high damage weapon with a high damage projectile, leaving it both good for groups as well as taking out early bosses. Since it's just a better Ice Blade, I'm going to give it the B tier because you could probably use this against some harder bosses with some care. The Star Fury. Now the Star Fury is a fantastic weapon. You just get yourself a gravity potion and this will honestly be your main sword for a long time in pre-hard mode. It will carry you through those important early game bosses and events and give you a great stepping stone into the best equipment. A tier for the Star Fury. The Beekeeper. Now I actually really like the Beekeeper. I'm a big bee girl, bees are great. I just think its pre-hard mode sword melee range is a large hindrance to how powerful it can be. I'm gonna put it into the B tier. B tier, B, get it? B tier. The Light's Bane. I don't think either of the evil swords are that great here, and while I like the effect of the weapon and its lingering damage slash, it's way too short and the damage is not high enough. C tier. The Blood Butcherer, the opposite of the Light's Bane, both in evil and downsides. While the range of the Blood Butcherer is not the worst, it is a true melee weapon, and even though the bleed is rather strong, you have to actually hit with the melee strike. C tier for the Blood Butcherer. The Blade of Grass. Now, it is a fantastic option, even though I find it to be one of the more forgettable options in the list of swords. Usually only making it when I'm ready for the Knight's Edge, but by itself, it still has some very solid potential with its projectile and powerful poison. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Volcano. I really love the Volcano. It was the saving grace in my swords only playthrough during pre-hard mode, getting me through Skeletron, which was a big hurdle at the time. It also just shreds through basic enemies and events. A tier for the Volcano for sure. The Muramasa. I don't really know what this weapon is used for outside of the Knight's Edge. There's not many bosses left at this point in progression, and all the events are done, maybe besides the Old One's army, but I just don't think it's great. It has a nice DPS and decent range on the swing, so I'm going to put it into B tier at least, because it is just as usable as the Volcano. The Knight's Edge. I mean, it's S tier. The Knight's Edge is crazy, absolutely shreds through the wall of flesh and every boss you could fight in pre-hard mode. And it can cook in the early hard mode stages while grabbing your upgrades. It's a fantastic weapon, no doubt that it's S tier. The Umbrella, the Tragic Umbrella, the Breathing Reed, the Ruler, and the Stylish Scissors. Alright, so all of these weapons are gimmick weapons. The Stylish Scissors being a drop from the Stylus like the Scimitar from before, but laughably short with its range, and literally all of the others are tools that just happen to have melee attacks. F tier for all of them. Moving on to the hard mode swords, we've got the Pearlwood Sword. I mean, do I really need to say anything here? F tier. The Classy Cane, similarly, do I need to say much? F tier, it's a joke weapon. The Slap Hand, you know as much as I do that I really want to put the Slap Hand into F tier, but that knockback is kind of crazy though, and also just kind of funny, and for that, C tier. The Breaker Blade, although I don't particularly think the Breaker Blade is the greatest sword, I think if you were to get this coming straight into hard mode, it can easily fend off the basic enemies for a long time while you spend the time to set up. B tier for the Breaker Blade. The Phase Sabers. The Phase Sabers are just straight upgrades from the Phase Blade as soon as you get into hard mode. And while they are decent, I think something like the Knight's Edge or the Breaker Blade are going to be much more useful for you at the beginning of hard mode. C tier for the Sabers. The Hambat. Now, despite the Hambat's nice bonus to your life regen, its short range is not great to have this far into a playthrough, and overall, those positives cannot outweigh its negatives. F tier. The Blade Tongue. The Blade Tongue is one of the weapons I slept on in my first tier list. This thing is very solid. It has an incredibly low range, but against crowds and even bosses like the Destroyer where you can get close easily, the aggro stream it fires do so much for it. I think if it had a bit more range, it'd be higher, but I'm going to give it the B tier. The Fetid Bognocks. The Fetid Bognocks are actually pretty crazy if you've never used them before. Get like a tanky melee speed build going, and just shred through the enemies at crazy speeds. Not the greatest, but I do think it deserves a spot in the B tier for just how unique the weapon is. Cobalt and Palladium Swords. There is no reason to use these. F tier. The Mithril and Orichalcum Swords. There is no reason to use these. F tier. Adamantite and Titanium Swords. Once again, no reason. F tier. The Icicle. Basically our first projectile weapon in hard mode, and it's decent. I wish the projectile was maybe a bit bigger or lasted longer, but it can definitely give you some much needed space against the hard mode bosses. B tier for the Icicle. The Frostbrand. I think the Frostbrand is very similar to the Icicle, and almost everything I said for it, I could save for the Frostbrand. I'm just going to stick it into the same tier in B. Cutlass. Now I know there are some Cutlass defenders out there, and I'm here to say that I am not one of them. This thing is a terrible range true melee weapon. It can swing fast enough to keep enemies off of you, but so can better weapons that are also easier to get. No point in ever getting this thing. F tier. The Beam Sword. Incredibly hard to get. It sucks. Get the Frostbrand instead. F tier. The Excalibur. Excalibur is a fantastic weapon. I think it's one of the best true melee weapons due to its insane reach and fast speed. Decent option against the Destroyer and actually decent against Skeletron due to its high damage. But getting its upgraded form so shortly after definitely bumps it down a tier. B tier for the Excalibur. The Chlorophyte Saber. Now this thing is actually a sleeper. I don't think it's as good as a lot of the higher placed weapons for sure, but it swings fast, and even with its low range, it has this little green cloud that hits pretty quick. B tier for the Saber. The Chlorophyte Claymore. Similar to the Excalibur, this weapon has a large range, but it actually shoots out a piercing orb that makes it fantastic against large groups, as well as keeping some distance in a boss fight. It's not good enough to solo the bosses right after getting it, however, so I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Seedler. Okay, so I may have been too tough on the Seedler in the original tier list. I also may have been completely wrong. This thing is absolutely an A tier weapon. The sword itself is nothing crazy, but its projectile is one of the best you can get at this stage of the game. It's an amazing weapon against Golem, and it shoots fast enough that you can easily use it against some harder bosses as well. A tier for the Seedler. The Brand of the Inferno. Okay, so the Brand of the Inferno I was also pretty hard on, but I think I was actually right with this one. It's a true melee weapon with a really fast speed and high enough damage. Its special gimmick is that you can right click and give yourself a quick defense buff, which is fine, but I don't find it that useful overall as a weapon. C tier for the Brand of the Inferno. The Death Sickle. Now this is an all-time favorite of mine and many people, and I think it actually still manages to live up to those standards. It has an amazing projectile with high damage available right after the mech bosses. It's a great weapon against Plantera, the Moon Events, and Golem. A tier for the Death Sickle. The True Knight's Edge. So I think I may have rated this a bit too high last time. It is a great weapon, but its projectile leaves a lot to be desired damage and control wise, and the swing itself isn't fantastic. I'm going to put it into the B tier for this list. True Excalibur. Similarly, I definitely overrated this one in the last tier list. I still do really like this weapon a lot, and I like it more than the Knight's Edge, but overall, I think it's no more useful than it. B tier as well. The Terra Blade. The combination of the last two weapons is still to this day a great weapon all around. There's no real downside to it, swings fast, does crazy damage, and has a fast and piercing projectile. This can easily take you to the end game. It goes in S tier. The Horseman's Blade. The Horseman's Blade is definitely the weapon that the most people yelled at me for in the comments of the last list, and you know what? Fine. You were alright. The Horseman's Blade is great. Decent against bosses if you're tanky enough, and fantastic against large groups of enemies. I'll give it the A tier. The Key Brand. I still hate this one though. Key Brand is terrible. It's a post-plane Terra true melee weapon that is outclassed by every other weapon around it. F tier. The Psycho Knife. The Psycho Knife is generally one of the greatest weapons in Terraria. That doesn't mean it's good though. Incredibly small range, and even its high damage and insane attack speed can't make up for that. Fun to use though, F tier. Christmas Sword. I really enjoy the Christmas Sword actually. I know, it's kind of crazy what happens when you actually use the weapons. Its projectiles are utterly fantastic, allowing you to get consistent damage even if you miss with the OG projectile. A tier for the Christmas Tree Sword. The Influx Waver. Okay, so I wanted to put this in A tier just because I didn't want to admit how wrong I really was. But this thing, with its fast projectile, that then auto hits with like 3 more, is so good. Its swing is terrible for sure, but its fast projectile puts it up into S tier. It's just as good as the Terra Blade easily. The Flying Dragon. So while I think this weapon is a little boring and could definitely use a rework of some kind, I have to admit that it is just as good, if not better, than the Terra Blade. So for that, I have to put it into the S tier. The consequences of the Terra Blade. The Starlight. Okay, fine. Starlight isn't all that great, but I still really love it for being incredibly unique and trying to make a late game short sword that works well. And it does do that still. I'm going to put it into the A tier because I like it. The Star Wrath. Now the Star Wrath is a fantastic sword, probably the best in the game if we aren't counting the Zenith as one. Insanely fast swing speed and a super powerful barrage of stars that can easily deal with any boss or event. S tier for sure. The Meowmere. Just like the other S tier weapons, this one easily deserves the spot. I think it's just as good as the Star Wrath despite a weaker projectile. It gives you more direct accuracy and I really enjoy using it. S tier. The Zenith. A lot of people were really confused by my omitting the Zenith in the last video, but it's because they didn't watch the thing. The Zenith is technically classified as an other weapon, but just for you, I'm gonna put it into the S tier in swords. And really, it deserves its own spot above S due to how insanely OP it is compared to literally everything else in the game. Let's go ahead and move out of swords and on to yo-yos. The Wooden Yo-Yo. There isn't much to talk about with the Wooden Yo-Yo. It's definitely one of the better melee weapons that you could craft early on. As a yo-yo, it is definitely not great. F tier. The Rally. Now this is a rare drop from certain enemies down in the caves, but being able to get it early can give you a much higher boost in your early game and easily get you through the Eye, King Slime, and Goblin Army. I'm going to put it into the C tier just because I think you could just as easily use the Wooden Yo-Yo to craft yourself a better one than get this one. The Melees and the Artery. The Melees and Artery I'm going to group together due to being the World Evil weapons, but they are both just slightly above average. Good damage yo-yos, nothing too insane about either of them, but perfectly usable. I'm going to put them right into the B tier. The Amazon. Alright, the Amazon continues to be just an absolutely insane weapon. Super easy to craft right out of the gate, and it has enough raw power to just carry you through a good portion of pre-hard mode. I'm going to keep saying it's S tier just for how bad the yo-yo power scaling is in Terraria. The Code 1. The Code 1's only downside is it being tied to the Traveling Merchant, and I almost never see this thing. If it were more easily obtainable, it'd be S tier for sure. But that alone has me bumping it down to the A tier. Otherwise, it's a fantastic weapon pre-Skeletron, but there is still a better choice. Okay, now the high five is Based. I love this yo-yo. Most B weapons are pretty good in Terraria, and yo-yos already have an edge on everything else. I genuinely think this is a sleeper S tier weapon, so I'm throwing it up in there. The Valor. Okay, so the Valor really isn't terrible, all things considered, except that I hate it. There's almost no point in using this yo-yo, because at the same time, you can get a far better one, and even the yo-yos before this one have more use. F tier for the Valor, it's probably my least favorite yo-yo. The Cascade. The Cascade is definitely the best yo-yo to take with you into hard mode and a decent enough option at Wall of Fresh to progress you through the game. I'm going to put it in the A tier just because you do end up replacing it fairly quickly, so it does not deserve that S tier spot. The Format C. The Format C actually isn't even bad, but the main thing here is that it's a weapon you have to buy from the Skeleton Merchant during a specific moon phase, when you can just get a far better yo-yo right away without needing to get lucky. F tier for that alone. The Gradient. The exact same issues as the Format C. The increased damage for this one is a lot better, but still there are better weapons available that are way easier. F tier. The Sheik. The Sheik is easily the weakest of the early hard mode yo-yos, but it is super easy to craft and you can use it to get the better ones even easier. I'm going to put it into the C tier. Easy to get, still decently useful. The Hellfire. The Hellfire is one of the 2 game-breaking yo-yos in early hard mode, and one of the reasons yo-yos needs a massive power balance. It hits fast, inflicts on fire, and has a long reach, as well as being attainable straight into hard mode. I'm going to put it into the A tier just because the next yo-yo is so much crazier. The Amarok. The Amarok is the strongest yo-yo obtainable pre-mech bosses and is super easy to get at that. Plus it has the highest possible damage with its Frostburn debuff and a nice speed and range. This yo-yo alone practically obliterates the yo-yo progression in the game. Something definitely needs to be changed, but this yo-yo is going into the S tier. The Code 2. Now the Code 2 is obtainable after any mech boss is defeated, but by the Traveling Merchant. There are very few weapons that can still be worth if they're locked to the Merchant, and this is definitely not one of them. Does nothing better than the previous yo-yos or the later yo-yos. F tier for sure. The Yellets. The Yellets is another yo-yo obtainable right after any mech boss has been defeated, but this one you can actually get really easily from any enemy in the jungle. And it's overall a decent upgrade from the yo-yos you'll have. I'm going to put it into the B tier just because there are a few other yo-yos you could grind out if you wanted. The Red's Throw and Valkyrie yo-yo. These 2 yo-yos can be obtained at any point in hard mode from hard mode boss treasure bags as a part of vanity sets, and they are very, very good. You might not ever see these in a playthrough, but you could set yourself up for some easy mech boss grinding and just go crazy and hope you get one. I'm going to put them into the A tier just because there is a decently high chance that you just don't obtain either of these sets. The Kraken. The Kraken is a post-Plantera dungeon drop, able to be obtained from any enemy in there, and overall it's really solid. I wouldn't say it's entirely worth going out and farming for, however. It does a decent amount of damage, but not enough where you would have to go replace your older yo-yo with it, especially when you only need to take out Golem for the best pre-in-game yo-yo after this. Overall, I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Eye of Cthulhu. The Eye of Cthulhu is an incredibly easy yo-yo to get. Right after Golem, just head over to the Solar Eclipse realm and farm out some Mothrons. It's a high chance to drop, so you're definitely going to get one, and it's a massive damage jump. It's the yo-yo you're going to take through the rest of the game. I'm going to give it the S tier. The Terrarian. The Terrarian, whatever. Hands down the best yo-yo and one of the best melee weapons in all of Terraria actually, giving you both the power of the late game yo-yos and it rapidly shoots out these little balls that do even more crazy damage. Definitely one of the goats and a great option against Daytime Empress. I'm going for the S tier easily. Let's get out of yo-yos and move on to spears, my favorite melee weapon class. The Spear. The spear is obtainable from basic wooden chests from the start of the game. It does carry some use in being able to prevent groups of enemies from hitting you super easily with its knockback. Unfortunately, you can get 2 better spears at the exact same time, and one of them just as easily. I've got to put it into the F tier. The Trident. Similar to the spear in almost every way, this weapon is just a slight upgrade. Better damage and slightly faster, obtainable just as easily. I think you can't really put it any higher than the spear itself though, since they're almost exactly the same. So it goes in the F tier too. The Storm Spear. Now the Storm Spear is a fantastic early option, perfect for taking out the early pre-hard mode bosses, getting you a bit of range to work with to keep yourself alive. I'm going to put it up into the A tier just for how useful it is early on. And you can honestly use this even further against something like Skeletron. The Rotted Fork. This weapon is almost exclusively good for something like the Brain and the dungeon itself. Otherwise, it's just a glorified, cool looking version of the base sphere. It is powerful though, so I'm going to put it into the C tier. The Swordfish. This thing is actually bad. Like, it attacks fast and has higher damage than everything else, but you gotta be right on the enemy with it. It's no better than any of the other spears at dealing with normal enemies either. F tier. The Dark Lance. The Dark Lance is actually incredibly solid. Obtainable after Skeletron in the Shadow Chest, it has a fast speed and decent range. It also, in its newest rework, inflicts the Shadow Flame debuff with its little shockwave. It actually grows in size based on your melee speed. It's not great enough to be an S tier, and maybe not even an A due to where it's at in the game. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Cobalt Naginata, the Palladium Pike, the Mithril Halberd, and the Orichalcum Halberd. Let's be real, who in their right mind is ever crafting and then using these weapons? You're just going to skip to the final set. F tier. The Adamantite Glaive and Titanium Trident. The final set of spears for the hard mode ore are not much better than the others, but the fact that you will probably make these and use these at least bumps them up to the C tier. Obsidian Swordfish. Literally, why does this exist? F tier. The Gungnir. This is the first really great spear in the game, crafted with hallowed bars, really solid, great damage, and is what you'll use to clean up the rest of the mech bosses for sure. You could even take it to Plantera if you wanted. I'm going to put it into the A tier. The Chlorophyte Partisan. The Chlorophyte Partisan is pretty decent. I don't think it's better than the Gungnir, but I do like the little poison cloud you get with it, giving you some extra range. I think this is the perfect weapon for the B tier. The Mushroom Spear. I don't know if it's just me, but while testing this weapon, I just didn't see anything that special about it. The mushrooms don't give you any extra range, and its damage doesn't really make up for it. I'm just going to put it into the C tier since it's not entirely useless. The Ghastly Glaive. Much like the Mushroom Spear, I don't really see what's super special about this one. It has a very short range and it seems almost made for the event that you get it from in the old one's army, like most weapons. It does have high damage potential, but only against groups of enemies. C tier just because I don't see the use for it. The North Pole. Now the North Pole is the one and only S tier spear on the list. It gives you a great ranged projectile that leaves behind a trail of snowflakes and is definitely the weapon you'll be using to finish out the game. I think it does deserve that S tier spot for that alone, but please give us more and better spears, please Terraria. And finally, the Jousting Lances. I decided to just throw in all the Jousting Lances to the spear section. They are not great. They have high damage potential, but they're really gimmick weapons more than anything else. I'm gonna throw them into the C tier. Alright, ending out the spears, let's move on to the Boomerangs. Starting with the Wooden Boomerang. The Wooden Boomerang is not actually the worst thing ever. It has decent knockback, but it's slow and has low damage, but mainly its biggest downside is that you can easily upgrade it into something way better. So I'm gonna put it into the F tier. The Enchanted Boomerang. Now the Enchanted Boomerang is a lot better than the Wooden Boomerang, and all you need is some Fallen Stars, and you can upgrade that straight into it. Overall, a very solid upgrade that you will grab anytime you're using the Wooden Boomerang, so for that, I'm gonna put it into the C tier. The Shroomerang. Now the Shroomerang is not much different from the Enchanted Boomerang, it's just significantly harder to obtain. But it makes up for that with even more damage than the Enchanted, so I'm just going to throw it in the same spot around C tier. The Ice Boomerang. The Ice Boomerang is basically just the Enchanted Boomerang with Frostburn, and that's great. Especially if you're on a Crimson world, it can be super useful for marking the real brain of Cthulhu in the fight. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Trimarang. The Trimarang is the ultimate upgrade for the last three, all combining into this one. Overall, a fantastic boomerang and one that you'll probably use in conjunction with others until the end of Pre-Hard Mode. I'm going to say for how early you can get it and how far it can take you, it has to go into the A tier at least, especially with being able to throw multiple. The Flamerang. The Flamerang is probably the closest thing to an S tier boomerang in Pre-Hard Mode, but I just don't think any of the Pre-Hard Mode boomerangs deserve that spot. The Flamerang is made using Hellstone and has a crazy high damage number and can be used to just shred through Skeletron. And it's a very powerful weapon against the wall while combined with others. We're going to put it into the A tier. The Fruitcake Chakram. The Fruitcake Chakram is on a similar power level to the Enchanted. It's a bit faster and the damage per second is very similar. But despite it being a Christmas time only weapon, it is going to grab a spot in C tier. The Thorn Chakram. This boomerang is definitely one of the best you can grab in the pre-boss portion of the game. Just head to the jungle and grab some easy materials. This thing is easily on par with stuff like the Ice Boomerang, but not quite the Trimarang or Flamerang. It gets a nice little spot in B tier. The Bloody Machete. Okay, so the Bloody Machete is available during Halloween, and while being a little bit stronger than the Fruitcake Chakram from Christmas, this one has one major downside, and that's if you miss, your punishment is way worse, because it has to fall until it hits the ground before bouncing back to you. I'm not putting it any higher than C tier. The Combat Wrench. Now the Combat Wrench is actually a fantastic weapon. You get it by killing the mechanic NPC, and it honestly might be in the top 3 boomerangs of Pre-Hard Mode. It's great for boss fights, being able to hit an enemy multiple times, and has piercing, which is the only Pre-Hard Mode boomerang to do so, I believe. I'm going to put it into the A tier. But into Hard Mode, we got the Flying Knife. Alright, so imagine this. You finally make it into Hard Mode, you choose to go after some hallowed mimics, and when this thing drops, you use it for the first time, you're like, okay, it's a decent weapon. But you're wrong, because it's actually a boomerang that literally can't miss, has infinite piercing and infinite airtime. This thing is crazy for early Hard Mode melee, letting you keep a far distance from the mech bosses while easily dealing with them. S tier for sure, this thing's so nuts. The Bananarang. The Bananarang is another fantastic early Hard Mode boomerang. This one is not nearly as insane as the Flying Knife, but it has a ton of extra damage and you can throw like 5 at a time. It's almost S tier, but I don't think it has the craziness factor that the Flying Knife does. A tier for sure though. The Sergeant United Shield. Now the Sergeant United Shield is amazing. It's a boomerang that just homes in on multiple enemies before returning to you, and with that it has a crazy high damage. The only downside this weapon has is being a traveling merchant weapon, and that's why I'm going to put it into A tier instead of S. The Light Disc. The Light Disc is actually a pretty decent weapon. My only issue is that it doesn't really do much for you at this point compared to some of the weapons we've already seen. The Bananarang does the same thing with just slightly worse damage, and that's available at a much better spot for a basic multi-throw boomerang. I'm going to put it into the B tier personally, but I'll also accept A. The Paladin's Hammer. The Paladin's Hammer is a fantastic weapon, hitting any enemies in its path twice, going back and forth. The only thing that could be remotely considered bad about it is its pretty short range, but I think its power makes up for it, especially when you're going to be taking on stuff like the moon events around this time. A tier for sure. The Possessed Hatchet. The Possessed Hatchet dropped by the lovely Golem is actually his best drop. And it's so good that in the Boomerang playthrough, it's what you'll be using until you beat the game most likely, and even if not, it's a great option to grind out some of those crazier melee weapons. But overall, this weapon is definitely S tier. Let's move on over to Flails, starting with the Chain Knife. While the chain knife can get you some pretty decent early DPS, it has a very little range compared to even the most basic of flails, and you'd be insanely close to the enemy to get that peak DPS, which in the early game can be very, very bad. F tier. The mace. The mace is actually really solid for a basic chest weapon. It's nothing crazy, but it can get some work in for you. I'm still going to be putting it into the F tier, however, because of the next weapon, which uses this as material. The flaming mace. The flaming mace is a direct upgrade to the mace, and it only needs torches, having the same amount of damage but with the added effect of fire, which makes it very solid. I'm going to move it up to the C tier, almost B tier, but the range on it holds it back. The Ball of Hurt. The Ball of Hurt isn't anything super special, but it has a fast speed and a lot larger range than the previous flails. I think that and its massive damage boost earns it a spot in at least B tier. The Meatball. The Meatball is basically the same as the Ball of Hurt, very similar damage, similar point in the game that you get it. The only real difference here is that the Meatball, weirdly, needs to be crafted instead of obtained from the Shadow Orbs and Hearts, which makes it a lot less useful at this exact point, but not enough to take it out of the B tier. The Blue Moon. The Blue Moon is actually a great high damage weapon. The only issue is that it's the next flail in the game progression, meaning you have to use the last two to beat Skeletron, and then you can get this one from the dungeon, or you can go get a far better one at the same time from shadow chests. Its high damage does still keep it in the C tier, however, but it could easily go down in F. The Sun Fury. The Sun Fury is easily the best pre-hard mode flail. It's the last one you get usually, and it's what you'll use to wrap it up, and even what you'll use to get yourself deeper into hard mode and grabbing those other flails. It has insane damage, and the on fire debuff is fantastic, so I'm going to throw it up into the A tier. Moving into hard mode, we got the Chain Guillotine. So I was definitely pretty tough on the Chain Guillotines in the first list, but having used them through the mech boss stage of the game now, they are just absolutely fantastic, especially when up against the twins. I don't think it's absolutely game destroying, but it definitely deserves to be up in A tier. The Anchor. So the Anchor is definitely a weapon, one of the flails of all time. I don't really like this thing. Unlike the main set of flails, it doesn't have the wind up attack and just flies straight out. It also doesn't pierce, and overall it's just not that good. F tier for me. The Tao of Pow. Now the Tao of Pow is a fantastic weapon. Pretty high damage, insanely long range, and one of the perfect early hard mode weapons to take on the Destroyer with its piercing. I'm going to put it into the B tier just because it's not that useful against the other two mech bosses. The Drippler Crippler. Now the Drippler Crippler is actually kind of crazy. Easily obtained from the Blood Moon Blood Eels, and has the highest damage out of any of these early hard mode flails. That alone, plus its ability to shred through the Destroyer, and even some of the mid hard mode bosses, puts it up in the A tier. It's just not that great against some of the faster ones. The Flower Pow. So the Flower Pow dropped by Plantera is a pretty unique flail. When you let it drop down, you can actually just let it sit there and shoot homing flower petals, and that's super good. Flails are pretty hard to use normally, so being able to have an alternate use that's just as good is fantastic. I'm going to put it into the B tier, however, just because you have to let the flail sit there in place to use it properly. The KO Cannon. So this is basically the early hard mode version of the chain knife, and it's terrible. It has so little range, and there are so many better options that you can use, especially since this is basically completely useless against any hard mode boss. F tier for sure. The Golem Fist. Unfortunately, the same issues that plague the KO Cannon plague the Golem Fist. It has a way larger range, but at this point in the game progression, you're mainly fighting fast, flying enemies that make the Golem Fist incredibly difficult to use, especially with its relatively slow fire rate. F tier, unfortunately. The Flairon. Flairon is such a good weapon, but it's a little too slow for the modern day Terraria in-game bosses. The bubbles do home in, but even then they have a pretty slow speed. It definitely isn't bad, and I'd say it's probably the best weapon to use to finish out the game, but I think Flails just have a natural disadvantage that prevents it from going into S and staying right in the A tier. Let's move on to the final category, other weapons. Starting with the Terragrim. The Terragrim, which is the new version of the Arcalis in pre-hard mode, is obtained out of enchanted shrines, and it is the same weapon. Pretty solid overall. You can use it to get through most bosses in pre-hard mode if you're careful enough. I'm going to throw it in B mainly because it's the only pre-hard mode other melee weapon. The Arcalis. Now the Arcalis is definitely still a pre-hard mode weapon, even though you can now only obtain it in treasure bags as a part of the dev set in hard mode. It just isn't good. I'm sorry to say that. We're going to have to throw it into the F tier. The Shadow Flame Knife. The Shadow Flame Knife is just okay. It doesn't do anything absolutely crazy, but it does give you a nice ranged weapon to work with. It can be pretty good when you get the knife bouncing all around multiple enemies. Overall, I'm just going to throw it into the C tier. The Sleepy Octopod. Now the Sleepy Octopod is weird. It swings around in a short range like a sword would almost, but every second or so it charges up. If it hits a block, it causes this little mini explosion. It's decent against large groups of enemies, but overall, I just don't think it's that useful compared to any other weapons around this point. So I'm throwing it down in the F tier. The Scourge of the Corruptor. Now the Scourge of the Corruptor is one of the sleeper hits of the dungeon chest weapons. A lot of people nowadays actually do recognize how good this thing is, but still it is just fantastic. You could probably use this from the moment you get it to the end of the game. Very solid, I'm throwing it in the A tier. The Vampire Knives. These things used to be the cream of the crop, the absolute coolest, most epic melee weapon you could get. Now they aren't that fantastic, but I still really like them, and that life regen boost is very, very good. I'm going to throw them up in the A tier with their corruption counterpart. The Sky Dragon's Fury. The Sky Dragon's Fury is a pretty solid weapon. It has the same issues I have with the Sleepy Octopod, but of course, this one has its right click ability that launches out spheres of electricity, and that's actually super good, and can even be useful against some of the faster flying bosses as they stay where you fire them. I'm going to put it up into the B tier. The Solar Eruption. Of course, the Solar Eruption is amazing. Like, the Solar Weapons are both absolutely insane for any melee playthrough, and I can't really say much about this one besides it has to go up in the S tier. The Daybreak. Just like its brother, the Daybreak is a fantastic weapon. Gives you amazing range for the melee class and comes combined with insane amounts of damage. It has to go up in the S tier as well. And this is where the Zenith would go, but it's up in the swords. That's going to wrap up the updated Melee Terraria tier list. The next one will be a massive tier list combining all of the classes into one insane weapons tier list, so stay tuned for that. And I'd like to give a quick shout out to my members, Quackenstein, Cheesecake, and Grunge Weeaboo. Thank you guys so much for supporting me. If you want to join them up here at the end of videos, you can go ahead and hit the join button down below. The first 10 members become founders, which lets you keep all of those benefits even after your membership runs out if you can't afford to support me anymore. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys hated my tier list, dislike the video and comment down below what you hated. If you liked it and agree that my opinions are based and factual, give me a like and make sure to subscribe. So thank you guys for watching. Love you guys. Bye.